Okay, it's about 3 past, so I think we'll get started now. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Mike Zeller. I'm the Assistant Director at the Shrewsbury Public Library, and I'm happy to welcome you to our program tonight, The Color of Law. A little bit of housekeeping. This isn't one of our grant-funded programs. We recently received a grant to fund a series of programs based around empathy and understanding, and a number of those are focused on issues of social justice and community building. So if you're interested in this program, you may be interested in those as well. So we would ask that you check out our calendar. If you have any questions for Professor Rothstein, please feel free to put them in the chat. There'll be a Q&A at the end of the program that I'll moderate. So without further ado, Richard Rothstein is a research associate of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, the critically acclaimed book, which is the subject of tonight's talk. He currently resides in California, where he is a fellow of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. So I'm going to disappear now, and I will turn it over to our esteemed guest. Welcome, Richard. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much, Mike. And thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation this evening. I want to begin by reminding all of us that we had a civil rights movement in this country in the 1960s and 50s. It actually began in the 1930s when civil rights lawyers challenged the segregation of law schools. And then they went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, challenged the segregation of elementary and secondary schools. And in 1954, got the Supreme Court to prohibit ongoing segregation in elementary and secondary education. That Supreme Court decision, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, gave impetus and stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. Others were very seriously injured. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not all of it, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. And by the end of the 1960s, with that understanding, the civil rights movement had succeeded in ending segregation of public accommodations, restaurants, of public transportation, buses, of employment. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that civil rights movement succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement pretty much ended, went home, and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them, clearly defined areas in every one that I lived in. There was either all white or mostly white. Clearly defined areas in every one that I lived in. There was either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society, how could it be that we tolerate apartheid conditions when it comes to our residences? Well, I think partly it's because once we have residential segregation, it's hard to undo. If we decide, as we did, to abolish segregation in restaurants or buses, we can pass an ordinance prohibiting it, and the next day you can sit in any restaurant, ride anywhere you want on a bus in any seat. But if we pass an ordinance prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things would look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, Blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, all of us, we've adopted a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for ending the civil rights struggle and accepting neighborhood segregation. And the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the forms of segregation that the civil rights movement addressed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, that was all done by government. If restaurants were being segregated, that was because of a local ordinance, a civil rights violation. It was a violation of the 14th Amendment for a local government to require segregation. And we understand that if civil rights are being violated, we have an obligation to end that violation and to redress it if necessary. If the federal government was doing it, for example, requiring segregation on interstate trains, that was a Fifth Amendment violation, another civil rights violation, something we have an obligation as American citizens to redress. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by ordinance, by public policy. That just sort of happened by accident, happened naturally. It happened because private homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or it happened because private businesses, banks, real estate agencies, developers segregated their private sector activities, creating separate housing for Blacks and whites in different areas. Or maybe we tell ourselves, and this is an explanation that's become more common lately, it's just because Blacks and whites like to live with each other in the same areas. We feel more comfortable that way, being in segregated neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites. It's not true in every case, but on average, that's the case. And so there are many African Americans who can't afford to move to middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector, non-governmental actions of self-choice, economic trends is what created segregation. We tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. The Supreme Court has endorsed this view. It describes our segregation as de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, but not in law. Well, let me give you some background of how I came to this book, The Color of Law. I was an education policy analyst. I didn't know much about housing or housing segregation. I was writing about education in the 1990s and 2000s. I was the education columnist at the New York Times. And during the time I was that education columnist, we had a national theory of why African American children achieved at lower levels than white children. We called it an achievement gap. And we said the reason there was an achievement gap, the reason African American children had lower achievement than whites, was because teachers of Black children just didn't try very hard. They were lazy or maybe bigoted. They didn't want Black children to learn. And only if we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. Now, maybe this sounds ludicrous to you as a theory of what causes the achievement gap. It sounded ludicrous to me at the time, although it was widely accepted across the political spectrum. In 2001, we passed a law, you may recall this, the No Child Left Behind law, that required children to be tested every year and their test scores reported by racial group. And the idea is that if you can embarrass teachers by showing that their Black students achieved at lower levels than their white students, the teachers would try harder and the achievement gap would disappear. It's incredible to me that we would pass a law like that, but we did. It, of course, failed. 20 years later, the achievement gap isn't much different than it was in 2001 when the law was passed. The only thing that law accomplished, the No Child Left Behind law, was it gave schools an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and instead spend inordinate time drilling children in test-taking skills to try to raise their test scores. I understood, and I wrote about this, that the reason that there's an achievement gap between Black and white children is not because teachers are lazy. Of course, there are some teachers who are lazy. There are some people in every profession who are lazy. Michael, you can tell me if I'm wrong. Maybe librarians are an exception. Maybe there are no lazy librarians, but in every other profession there's some, but that's not the reason we have an achievement gap in schools. The reason we have an achievement gap in schools is because so many black and white children, black children in particular, so many black children come to school with social and economic disadvantages and impede their ability to learn. And that have nothing to do with how hard teachers try to teach them. So I remember writing one column in the Times about asthma. African-American children, as you may know, have asthma at much higher rates than middle-class children. In some metropolitan areas, it's as high as 4 times the rate. African-American children have asthma at a higher rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more industrial plants nearby, more trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more dust in the environment, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, I'm not saying in every case, but more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to be up at night wheezing and then come to school a bit drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition of the group, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have slightly lower average achievement simply because it's drowsier on average when it comes to school. Well, asthma has a small impact on the achievement gap. It doesn't make a big difference, small one. But then you begin to think of all the other social and economic challenges that Black children come to school with. Asthma, lead poisoning. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. Black children have higher rates of lead poisoning than white children because they live in more buildings that are likely to be peeling lead-based paint. More lead polluting trucks, as I say, driving by their homes. More lead pipes delivering water to their homes. Lead poisoning, as I say, has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity. You begin to add all of these up, and you've pretty much explained the achievement gap, leaving very little left to explain by lazy teachers. Well, I began to think about this and realized it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or any of a number of other such conditions. I wrote a book about this called Class and Schools back in 2004. And I began to realize it's one thing if children have these conditions. What happens when you have a school where every child has one or more of these characteristics? How can you ever expect such a school to achieve at the same level as a school where children come healthy, well-rested, in economically secure homes? You can't possibly have that explanation, that condition where children, where those schools have equal outcomes. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children like that with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today in this country than they ever have been in the last 45 years. And the reason that they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think, and I was an education policy analyst. I wasn't thinking about housing, but I began to think that maybe housing segregation, neighborhood segregation in particular, that caused the school segregation, that this was a school problem. It wasn't just a housing problem. And this is what I was thinking about in 2007, when I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated a program of 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those school districts had a very, very token school desegregation plan. They recognized that concentrating children with these kinds of disadvantages at single schools was going to depress their achievement. And so they enacted a plan in which parents could choose which school in the entire district their child would attend. But if the parent's choice was going to intensify segregation, that choice would not be honored. in favor of the choice of a child who wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white, a mostly white school, had just a few places left in it, both a black and a white child applied for one of those last remaining places, the black child would be given some preference. Help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial program. You don't have just a few places left in the school very often, and both a black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. In fact, they said it was unconstitutional to do such a thing. The decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that the schools in Louisville, Seattle, indeed were segregated, but he said they were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. He was right about that. But then he went on to say that the neighborhoods were segregated. The term he used was de facto, not by government action, but because of private bigotry and private businesses and people wanting to live with each other of the same race and economic differences. And he said, where you have de facto segregation, something the government had nothing to do with, it's a violation of the Constitution for government to try to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the two districts involved some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife, a child, wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his suburb and then resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop them. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop that. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. When the police, the criminal justice system, the courts are all embarked on a conspiracy to maintain racial segregation in Louisville. I looked into it further and I found that this wasn't unusual, and I'm not exaggerating here. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases nationwide of police protected, sometimes police organized and led, mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these cases was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment. The police are state actors, agents of the state. And therefore, we have an obligation, all of us as American citizens, to redress that violation, but we've never undertaken the obligation to do so. Well, I began to look into it further, and I found that state-sponsored violence in violation of the 14th Amendment wasn't the only governmental cause of racial segregation. There are many, many federal, state, and local policies, all designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, all of them unconstitutional, all of them imposing an obligation on every one of us to remedy it, but we've never accepted that obligation. Well, let me spend a few minutes that I have with you this evening describing a couple of the major policies that the federal government followed. I don't have time to describe very many of them, but let me describe some of the major policies the federal government followed to ensure that we live in an apartheid society. Perhaps the most powerful one was a program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period to move the entire white working class and middle class population out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburban single family home neighborhoods and prohibit African Americans from joining in this exodus from urban areas. Now, as background, let me say that at the time, in the early and up to the mid-20th century, most African Americans and whites lived in downtown urban areas. They lived there because we were a manufacturing economy, and factories had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. So the workers, both black and white, had to live close enough to those factories to walk to work, maybe take short streetcar rides. The banks that serviced them and other service firms also had to be located close enough to the factories themselves. So we had many integrated downtown areas. Not every area was integrated. We had lots of informal segregation as well, but there were many integrated urban areas. The federal government embarked on a program to move the entire white population out of these areas, urban areas, into single-family homes in all white suburbs. And you're familiar with them. They exist in every metropolitan area of this country. They exist, these suburbs that were created by the FHA and VA. They exist around Hartford. They exist around Boston. They're everywhere. Perhaps the most famous of them, and I'm sure you've read about it, and I wrote about it in The Color of Law, was Levittown, east of New York City. I imagine you've heard of that one. 17,000 homes in a rural area just east of New York City. The builder, William Levitt, could never assemble the capital to build those homes, to buy the land, and build 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him that money on such a speculative venture. The only way that Levitt could build that suburb, and this is true of the suburbs across the country, the only way he could build it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, the architectural designs, the materials he's going to use, the layout of the streets, and a commitment that the Federal Housing Administration and VA required, that he never sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the FHA and VA. It was written out in a federal manual called the Underwriting Manual. The manual was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend applications of builders to create subdivisions. The manual said that you could not recommend a federal bank guarantee for a developer who was going to build an all-white project if he was going to allow African Americans to move into it. The manual even said you couldn't recommend a federal bank guarantee for an all-white project that remained all-white if it was located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the developer of an all-white subdivision had to construct at the Federal Housing Administration's requirement in order to get a bank guarantee for his loans, because that wall would keep African Americans from a nearby neighborhood from walking into his development. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. This was an unconstitutional system that created the racial landscape that we have today. And the consequences of this particular policy, and as I said, there were many federal, state, and local policies that also contributed. But the consequences of this particular policy are enormous. Those homes that were sold in the mid-20th century, Levittown, for example, were inexpensive for working class families. They cost in the mid-20th century, that is around 1950, about $8,000 to $9,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted money, that's about $100,000. Returning war veterans were required to make no down payment on their FHA and VA amortized loans. White families were subsidized to buy these homes at these prices. African Americans prohibited from doing so, even though a $100,000 home, especially with no down payment, was easily affordable to African Americans who had jobs in the post-war boom, but they were created as all-white projects by federal government decree. Well, as you know, those homes in suburbs, not only like Levittown, but the ones in your community near Hartford or Boston, no longer sell for $100,000. They go, depending on the part of the country, for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some parts of the country, $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained over the next few generations wealth from the equity, the appreciation of the value of their homes. They use that wealth to send their children to college. They use it to finance perhaps temporary emergencies, temporary unemployment, or maybe a medical emergency. They use their wealth to subsidize their retirements. And they use their wealth to bequeath wealth to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans are prohibited by federal government policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes on average. Family, there's some much higher, some lower, but about 60% on average. You'd think if the income ratio is about 60%, the wealth ratio would be the same. People could save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American incomes, family incomes, are about 60% on average of white incomes, African American household wealth is about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied, that we, as I say, as American citizens, have an obligation to remedy, but we've never undertaken to meet that obligation. Well, the consequences of this wealth gap and the segregation that the federal government created with just one policy, and I haven't yet mentioned any others, are enormous. I began my meeting with you this evening by talking about the achievement gap that results from the concentration of children and lower income families in single neighborhoods. Their families have no opportunity, no wealth by which they can make down payments for homes outside those neighborhoods. And the achievement gap in schools is almost a direct consequence of this policy of segregation. Another consequence is health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you may know, have life expectancies that average less than white life expectancies. They have greater rates of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, because they live in neighborhoods with less access to fresh food, the same polluted neighborhoods that I talked about before. The wealth disparities and the segregation that they reflect are also responsible in large part for the police abuse of young African American men, more than abuse, murder in some cases, that we spent so much time demonstrating against a year and a half ago in Black Lives Matter demonstrations. I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse a young man if it weren't for racial segregation. But when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to jobs, no access to the transportation to get those jobs, no ability to attend schools that aren't overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their children. And when you concentrate young men in neighborhoods like that, it's inevitable that the police are going to engage in confrontations with them, that the police are going to develop tactics of control that are characteristic of police anytime they are attempting to control a disadvantaged, isolated population. It's similar to the tactics of control that the colonial forces adopted in third world countries in the 20th century, whether the Congo or India. And the racial segregation that we created our government acting on our behalf, the racial segregation that we created in the 20th century is also responsible for something else that's very, very frightening and dangerous. And that's the enormous political polarization that we have in this country. It's greater perhaps than any time since the 1850s that led to a civil war. I'm not suggesting that the political polarization is entirely racial. It's not. But I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we did admit that it largely tracks racial lines. How could we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to defend this democracy, to preserve this democracy, if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other, to create that common national identity. So these are some of the consequences of that one policy that I just described, and there are many others. I'll briefly describe one other because I want to leave time for your questions and discussion. Public housing, something we all misunderstand. We think public housing is someplace that poor people live, single mothers with children, that's lots of those young men without jobs in the formal economy. That may be what public housing is frequently like today, but that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in the New Deal, in the Depression, in the Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. Public housing was for working families who had good jobs, who had stable incomes, who could afford to pay the full costs of the housing in their rent. We had a 25% unemployment rate in the Depression. Public housing was for the 75% who had jobs, but who couldn't find housing because in the Depression, there was so little construction activity going on. Everywhere the Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency to build public housing, everywhere it built it, it segregated it. Frequently segregating those downtown integrated neighborhoods that I described before that previously had not been segregated. I'm sure that Michael, your library has copies of books by the great African-American novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. He describes in his autobiography, The Big C. I hope you'll order it if you don't have it on your stacks so people can read it. He describes how he grew up in a downtown integrated Cleveland neighborhood. It's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. But he said in high school, his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. He went to an integrated high school because it was an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration in the 1930s went into that neighborhood in Cleveland, demolished some of the housing, and built separate projects for African Americans and for whites, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed, with those projects and others throughout the Cleveland area that helped to make Cleveland the segregated city that we know today. Coming closer to home, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I hope some of you don't take offense at this, but it's a smug place that thinks it's better than the rest of the country. Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area between Harvard and MIT, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was about half white and half black. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood. The federal government built two projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with that and other projects elsewhere in the Boston area, created the segregation that we know in Boston today. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries, jobs that had been scarce during the Depression. They overwhelmed the communities that the war plants were located in. And if the government wanted the tanks and the jeeps and the aircraft carriers and the planes and the ships to be produced, it had to find housing for these workers, and it did. Everywhere, the government built housing for war workers, and there were hundreds of thousands of them. It segregated them, creating separate projects during World War II for white war workers and black war workers. This is how the West Coast came to be segregated. The West Coast, as you may know, had very few African Americans before World War II. Historians call it the second great migration that brought African Americans to the West Coast to take jobs primarily in shipyards and in airplane factories during the war. The federal government created segregation where it hadn't previously existed. As I say, there would be very few African Americans living there prior to World War II. In San Francisco, for example, the federal government built 5 projects for shipyard workers, 4 for whites only, 1 for African Americans placed in the neighborhood that then became the Black neighborhood of San Francisco. And this was done throughout the country. Any place the war plant was built, the federal government created the housing for the war workers. Well, the policies to redress segregation that we have an obligation to implement are well known. There's no mystery about them. Policy experts, housing experts, journalists all spin out ideas about what we can do to redress segregation. We don't do it not because we don't know what to do. We don't do it because there's not a new civil rights movement that is creating the pressure, causing what the late Congressman John Lewis called the kind of good trouble that would force the country to pay attention to this and to redress segregation. I'm involved in helping a group of national civil rights leaders who are creating something they call a new movement to redress racial segregation. They are planning to launch it sometime in the next year. Its mission will be to hire local organizers to go into white and Black communities around the country to try to create new civil rights groups that can draw attention to the residential segregation that we have and what we need to do to remedy it. A year and a half ago, we had 20 million Americans demonstrating in Black Lives Matter protests, unheard of in this country's history. Of those 20 million, most were white, also unheard of in this country's history. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race, the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, than we ever have had before in American history. The challenge is to transfer that awareness into action, into organization, into people who will not only protest, but also take the careful, deliberate steps to create a movement to redress segregation. If any of you are interested in being informed when this new movement to redress racial segregation is launched, I can provide a link where you can sign up to get that information. If any of you want to write it down now, I can give it to you. It's simple. For the new movement to redress racial segregation, it's at nmrrs.org. And if you go to that link, you can simply sign up to get the announcement. That's all it requires. But with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And Michael, I'd be glad to engage in the question period.
Sure thing. So thank you, Professor Rothstein. That was pretty intense. I know I'm not alone in feeling that way watching the chat. So if anyone has questions or anything they'd like to say to Professor Rothstein, just put it right in the chat. There's a couple of questions already that I caught during the talk. Eric W. is actually the first message, said, I'm curious about researching the history of redlining in my town of Westboro, Mass. Do you have any suggestions as to how one would go about researching that history, such as resources to start with, questions to ask, or stakeholders to engage with?
Well, I know nothing about the community you're talking about, and every community obviously has a slightly different history, even although the underlying themes are the same. But I would start by going to your local public library whenever it's open, and look at local newspapers from the 1930s and 40s, and look at real estate ads, and look for real estate ads that boast of they're selling homes that are restricted. That would be one way to do it. Again, I don't know what county you're in or where the county deeds are kept, but go to your local county office, whatever, in some places it's called the recorder of deeds, sometimes it's the city clerk, and look at the deeds for homes in your community that will indicate if it was a subdivision that was built in the 1940s in particular, earlier than that perhaps, it's very likely that it will have a deed clause that says these homes are for Caucasians only, with the exception being that you're allowed to allow a domestic servant to live in your home. But aside from that, all residents of the community have to be white. So those are two places I would start. But again, when the new movement to redress racial segregation is launched, it will have a researcher who can provide specific guidance for particular communities as to how to go about that research.
Okay, we got another question from Bridget Hilton. Do white residents have an obligation to do work to make suburban communities more welcoming on a governmental and personal level for historically excluded people?
I'm sorry, say that again. I don't quite understand the question.
Oh, sorry. Do white residents have an obligation to do work to make suburban communities more welcoming on a governmental and personal level for historically excluded people?
Yes, absolutely. That I think was the theme of my remarks. Yes, every one of us has an obligation to redress this segregation because the consequences of it, as I said, are enormous. They still determine the inequality in this country today, and we're the most unequal of all the industrialized countries in the world. So yes, I think white residents have that obligation. And as I said earlier, they need to organize to make their communities more welcoming, to repeal the zoning ordinances that effectively ensure that only whites would live there by prohibiting multifamily dwellings, townhouses, garden apartments. That's one thing that can be done. But in more specifically, there's no way this problem can be solved without subsidizing the African Americans to move into neighborhoods that are now unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable to them when the communities were segregated. It is possible, and this goes also to the earlier question about research, it is possible to identify the banks, the real estate agencies, the developers that created the segregation in the 1930s and 40s and even 50s and 60s in those white communities. Those banks, those real estate agencies, those developers should be held accountable today for contributing to the redress of segregation by creating substantial funds to subsidize African Americans to move into communities from which that bank, that real estate agency, that developer excluded them. I wrote an article just recently, not 20 years ago when I was a columnist, but a year and a half ago in the New York Times, in which I described a community that's all white, created in the 1940s when the home sold for the equivalent of $100,000 today, and were identified and showed how the research was done. The bank, the realtor, and the developer that created that segregation. And I was able to identify the successors, the large bank that absorbed the small bank, the large real estate agency that absorbed the small real estate agency. And I argued in this article that that bank and that real estate agency, as well as the developer that still lives there today, absorbed their predecessors' assets and liabilities, which include their moral liabilities. And white residents of those communities should be holding those institutions accountable for the segregation of their communities. So my answer to your question in brief is yes. And let me say, Michael, if you send out an email after this event, I can give you the link to that article if anybody's interested in reading it.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you mentioned at the beginning, if anybody would like any information from Professor Rothstein, just let me know in the chat. And I can pass that along to him, and he'll put that together so I can send it out as an email tomorrow to everyone. So we have another question from Alex. Do you think Justice Roberts has since read your book, and has he ever been publicly questioned about his obviously wrong opinion about de facto segregation?
Well, I don't know, and I don't want to be glib about this, but I will. I don't care. Because the Supreme Court follows public opinion. And, I'm looking at, well, I see some of you have pictures on the, in your Zoom background, and I can't tell how old you are because I guess you like to put in younger pictures than you really are. But some of us have been corrupted by the 15-year period from 1954 to 1969, which is the only 15-year period in the entire history of this country when the Supreme Court has been a force for the defense of civil rights and civil liberties. That was the period of the Warren Court, 1954 to 1969. In every other period of this country's history, the Supreme Court has led the charge for the suppression of Black rights, for the denial of their civil rights, for the imposition of segregation. We passed, in the wake of the Civil War, 3 amendments. The 13th Amendment that effectively prohibited second-class citizenship for formerly enslaved African Americans. The 14th Amendment that prohibited state and local governments from taking any action to discriminate against the formerly enslaved and their descendants. The 15th Amendment that protected the right to vote. The Supreme Court effectively effectively repealed those 3 amendments that have never been permitted to be enforced. The 14th Amendment, as you may know, if any of you know history, the Supreme Court decided that really had nothing to do with equal rights for African Americans. That was all designed to protect property owners from government regulation. Some of us who grew up in that period between 1954 and 1969 have been, as I said, corrupted. We somehow believe that the Supreme Court will be our savior, and that Chief Justice John Roberts, to answer your question, if he simply read the history that I described, whether from my book or elsewhere, he would change his view. That's not the way the Supreme Court works. That may be what we wish it works, but that's not the way it works. The Supreme Court responds to public opinion and public pressure. It permitted desegregation in the 1960s and repealed its separate but equal doctrine in 1954 because there was a growing civil rights movement in this country that demanded it. And only with a new civil rights movement will a new Supreme Court decide that, well, maybe the Chief Justice Roberts' decision was wrong, and we should not only permit token efforts to desegregate, much more aggressive ones that are needed to deal with this really enormous problem that we've created.
Another question from Michelle Chalmers. Have you had the opportunity to engage and connect/present your work in Mississippi and Alabama? I wonder, in communities where there are many Black and white people living together in a state, how they would understand your work. What do you see changing since your book has been published? So I guess that's kind of a two-for question.
Well, let me take the second part first. I said, and I want to repeat, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than we ever have had before in American history. It's not just the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, it's the removal of statues that commemorate slavery across the South, commemorate the defenders of slavery, the generals who defended it. White elected Southern politicians are removing them, unheard of in American history. So we are having an awakening. And but an awakening itself does not fix it. And that's why I say we need to move to the next step. The next step is organization. And that's why a group like this new movement to redress racial segregation is necessary, to assist groups that want to organize to do so. If I understand the first question, the first part of the question, yes, there are desegregated communities in this country, but they're not the norm. They're not typical. And but they do show that it's possible to create a country that is not based on principles of inequality. There are many communities that have taken small steps to desegregate, very small steps, but they could be duplicated everywhere and expanded. There are some communities, for example, that have prohibited zoning rules that exclude African Americans. There are some communities that have created requirements that developers set aside a share of units for moderate and low-income families to help to promote the desegregation of that community. As I say, there are some communities that have repealed zoning rules that effectively exclude them. There are some that prohibit discrimination for against, I'm sure you heard the term Section 8 vouchers. It's a subsidy that's given to families, low-income working families, that for whom rent is too expensive. And it's permissible throughout the country to discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders, for a landlord to say, I'm not going to rent to you because part of your rent is contributed by the federal government. But there are some communities that have prohibited that kind of discrimination. So there are positive steps that have been taken, but they need to be accelerated to a great extent and become much more intense.
Okay, a question from Paula Dickerman. What are your thoughts about gentrification?
Well, gentrification is a situation where in a low-income Black community, whites begin to move into it, property values rise, rents rise, and soon it becomes a situation where the existing Black families are forced out because they can no longer afford to move to live in the communities where they've historically lived. I think if controlled, gentrification would be a good thing. Every community should be gentrified. It should have a mix of moderate, affluent, low-income housing, families. The problem is, how do you control gentrification so that it doesn't displace existing residents? And as I said before, the policies to do this are well known. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is the political will to do it. So, for example, we should have rigorous rent control that prohibits rent increases in excess of inflation simply because a community becomes more valuable to live in. We should have policies of inclusionary zoning that require new development to set aside a share of units for moderate, low-income families for existing residents. We should have freezes on property taxes for existing residents. One of the reasons, one of the biggest causes of displacement is that families who have owned their homes for many years, who don't owe a mortgage, who have full ownership of their homes, can no longer afford to live in them because the property values rise and they're paying property taxes they can't afford on homes that they've lived in for many, many years. Some people will say that if you freeze property taxes, you're going to rob the county and of revenues that it needs to function, but those property taxes can be returned to the Treasury at a point of sale. So, for example, if you have a homeowner in a gentrifying neighborhood who has owned his or her home for many years and pays property taxes at the rate that he or she paid initially, doesn't see an increase in property taxes. Home was bought maybe, I don't know, 40 years ago, 30 years ago for $50,000. It can now sell for $500,000. When that family sells the home, and instead of making a $450,000 gain, the lost property taxes at that point are returned to the Treasury, and maybe the family only makes a $400,000 gain. So those are the kinds of policies we could implement to prevent gentrification from displacing large numbers of people, and would preserve a stabilized a non-segregated neighborhood, we don't implement those policies, and that's why gentrification is such a problem for families who are being displaced.
We have a question from Melissa Hollenbach. Is there a comparable issue, or are there comparable issues in rural America, American farms, etc.?
Well, I only wrote a book about urban America. That's not an area of my expertise, and I don't comment on things I don't know anything about. It's quite possible that there are comparable issues. I've heard that there are, but I don't know any more than you do about it.
Okay, Betty asks, if housing policy are de jure rather than de facto, why aren't they challenged in court, and why can't there be judicial remedies to address them, much like busing was created to remedy school segregation?
Well, as I said earlier, the Supreme Court does not entertain remedies of any kind for segregation. The Supreme Court takes the view, you've probably heard the phrase, that the way to end discrimination on account of race is to end discrimination on account of race, which means you pretend there's no difference between blacks and whites, and there's no necessity for any policies to specifically benefit African Americans and permit them to move into neighborhoods from which they were excluded. That's the view of the Supreme Court, that we're a post-racial society, that everybody has equal opportunity, and that there's no need for remedies for past civil rights violations. The only way to change that is with a public movement. Simply making legal arguments to the present Supreme Court or the present lower courts are not going to accomplish the redress of the segregation that we've created.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. Reverend Janet asks, what role might reparation pay play in the solution to this historic wrong?
Well, I don't use the term reparations. It's a widely misunderstood term. Most people understand the term as a single monetary payment to the current generation of African Americans that's supposed to take care of all these problems. It's inconceivable that such a monetary payment would ever be large enough to fix the problem in the current generation. The segregation and its effects took many generations to create. It's not going to be fixed overnight. I use the term remedies or redress to talk about these policies. The subsidies I mentioned to African Americans to permit them to buy homes in neighborhoods from which they were excluded. Some people use the term reparations for it, but I think it's misleading, and it's not a helpful term, because if people who are not sophisticated think that you've done reparations, they'll wipe their hands of it and say, okay, we fixed that problem. We've done reparations. Now let's move on. Nothing further is necessary. So all of the things I talked about, you might call reparations, all of the remedies that I've talked about. But I prefer the term remedies and or redress of segregation, but it's the same thing. I just think we should be more specific about what we're talking about and not mislead people with a term that implies something very, very different from a narrowly targeted remedy for specific constitutional violation, of which there should be many such remedies.
Well, I think it's just after 8 o'clock, so I think we will wrap it up there. Again, Professor Rothstein, thank you so much for your time. This was really enlightening. The conversation in the chat was very lively. And yeah, I did get several direct messages from folks saying if there is anything that you can share with them, any follow-ups, any supplementary material, send it along to me and I'll pass it along to all of our attendees.
Okay, I'll send you a couple of things. Two that I mentioned, and I think there's one that I didn't mention that I'll send to you. Yeah.
Sure. Well, again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this program. I hope you got a lot out of it. And I hope you will be joining us at future programs. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody.